Hello, my name is Janbir Sandhu, and I am the Internship and Training Manager here at HomeFirst. Welcome to the training on harm reduction. Facilitator, please keep pace with the training. There are parts to this training that require you to pause me to facilitate a workshop, to facilitate discussions, and a game that we're going to play on harm reduction. So please have that mouse under with you when needed. All right, we're going to start talking about harm reduction today. And I want to go through the goals of the training with you. The goals of the training are to understand principles of harm reduction, to know the spectrum of use in harm reduction, to understand how to talk to someone about their use, about any risky behaviors in a non-judgmental way. How do we do that? To encourage clients, participants to build supports and build their progress, and to promote safer habits in participants. So what is harm reduction? I want to start by saying that harm reduction has a different meaning to different people based on their profession. And harm reduction in itself is a philosophy, an approach, and a set of principles that make our communities and the lives of our participants safer. It is not a standardized set or curriculum for an agency or a program to follow. It has the ability to blend into what we use. And you'll find out a little bit more about what I'm talking about when I say an approach and a set of principles rather than a full practice. Nevertheless, to say harm reduction is still an evidence-based practice and has been around for about 30 plus years, and it works. It works. Harm reduction is also that practical strategies. There's practical strategies that are aimed at reducing the negative consequences to harmful behaviors. Harm reduction is also a social justice movement that has a belief in and respect for those who use drugs or, again, any other risky behavior. This could be generalized. Harm reduction really came out of substance use literature, and there was the old medical model way of doing things where either we've got abstinence, where we completely are abstaining from a risky behavior or substance use, and on the other hand, we are using or we are completely partaking in some kind of a risky behavior. And those were the two options. We'll talk a little bit about what that spectrum looks like now and how do we help our participants to gain safer use. Okay, so the harm reduction spectrum incorporates safer use, and it begins with someone to really address the issues of where they currently are. So we're asking someone to think about their current use and the conditions of their use as they stand today. So there's no judgment in this. We're really asking people to be honest and to lead a dialogue with us about their current use. And we are taking this in a non-judgmental, supportive way. And you'll get to understand why is it that we do this. The importance is that we can convey to the folks that we're working with that we are doing this in order to help them understand their current use. We're not here to change their behaviors if they don't want that change, right? It all begins with them addressing their behaviors and risks to their behaviors should they see a need to address this. And we can work in other models of treatment to really highlight that. One of the models that comes to mind is motivational interviewing and the stages of change by Prochaska and DiClementi. The stages of change really highlight how someone is motivated to change their behavior and how one makes change. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as well, and how we address our conversations with someone and facilitate that in a respectful way. So number 4, because harm reduction strategies demand that interventions and policies are designed to serve users, really reflect that spectrum of their needs. There's no universal definition or formula for implementing harm reduction. So it has to be flexible in order for it to work. We cannot have an inflexible system of understanding someone's use if it doesn't work for them. If that was the case, then we would have somehow resolved addiction and somehow would have worked with everyone in reducing their harm. Right? So it has to be flexible enough to maintain the integrity of the individual and their current use. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is switch really quickly to our harm reduction worksheet. This should be in front of you currently. It's a 2-pager. And I want you to take a look at this because what we just talked about, the rights for individuals and strategies aimed to reduce negative consequences, all of that is up here. And these are the guiding set of principles for harm reduction, and they were developed by the Harm Reduction Coalition right here in the Bay Area, actually in Oakland, California. And we're working to bring the Harm Reduction Coalition to HomeFirst so that we can have real and honest discussions about how is it that we can apply harm reduction more thoroughly in our practices. So with that, let's review the principles that are central to harm reduction practice. So what I'm going to actually do is I'm going to review each statement here and give a few details. Pause me, facilitator, as you feel the need to add more to the discussion. If there's more around the table, that is absolutely wonderful. That's how things should be. That's how I lead this group in training in person. So pause me as needed if you have questions or would like to add to the conversation. The more richer the conversation, the more we get out of it. Okay, so the first principle, accepts for better or worse that illicit and licit use is part of our world and chooses to work to minimize its harmful effects rather than simply ignore them or condemn them. So this first principle says that as a practitioner, as a provider of services, we understand that substance use, risky behaviors are part of our world, and we're here to work with them to minimize their effect. We're not going to ignore that in the individual that we work with it, and we're not going to shun them away or condemn them because of their use. The next principle understands drug use as a complex, multifaceted phenomenon that encompasses a continuum of behaviors from severe abuse to total abstinence and acknowledges that some ways of using are clearly safer than others. So that's kind of where we talked about the spectrum, what things look like for an individual. So yes, substance use is complex. It has other additions that we can think about, other things that we go through as human beings. Our emotionality is attached to our use or our risky behaviors. And I want you to understand that spectrum that we're talking about here, the continuum of behaviors, on one end, severe use, on other end as total abstinence, has been around for a long time. And what harm reduction is doing is saying that there's a whole line of behaviors right in between use and abstinence. Right? I'll give you an example. I was working with a veteran outside of HomeFirst, and they were living in their van. This individual was also drinking about a 6-pack of beer a day. It was the hottest part of summer, and I asked them to, lead me through kind of what their evening plans look like. And they shared with me that they usually have their keys in the ignition and they're sitting and having their 6-pack of beer because it helps them cool off, helps them relax. If they were housed, this is what they would do. And again, if this veteran was housed, sitting in the comfort of his own home with the door shut, he's participating in something that's absolutely legal. But I began to probe about where was he using and what that looked like. Again, I had sort of like picturing a blackboard in my mind, and I'm trying to paint a picture to myself of what is his behavior, what is this risky behavior, could be risky, could be not risky, look like. And he mentioned that every day he'd drive to the local grocery store and pick up a 6-pack of his favorite beer. He would choose to drink it. So I asked him, where do you drink it? He shared he does so in the front, in the driver's seat of his car with the keys in the ignition because it's warm. He wants the AC on. And he also likes to listen to music. And that's how he relaxes. So I talked to him about his current use and what that would look like for a police officer driving by, right? So I'm reminding him of those risks. So reminding someone of those risks is also a very helpful strategy, and we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like later. So I reminded him of his risks, and then I asked him for safer alternatives. What do you think? How do we, the chances of you getting a DUI and sitting in that seat are quite high. So what can you do to use safer? And he mentioned, I guess I could sit in the passenger seat, right? You still have an open bottle of alcohol and your keys are still in the ignition, right? So the keys in the ignition was the key because the likelihood of someone picking up the key or switching from passenger to driver in case he wanted more quite high. So we talked about other strategies, and eventually over time we got to a place where this veteran was parked under a tree for shade and cool air with his back windows rolled down and his ignition off, his music off. He had his phone charged, was playing music on his phone in the very back of his van. So he's nowhere near the front. He's still at risk for that intoxication in public or open container in a vehicle, but it's a little bit less likely than worrying about a DUI if you're sitting in the front seat, in the driver's seat with your keys in the ignition. That looks like there's an intention to drive. So now we've reduced the risk of this person driving and causing harm to themselves and others. And we're also thinking about strategies and also thinking about where else he can enjoy his time, his beer without really looking and seeming like he's about to drive, and also reducing the chances of him driving. We continue to further reduce that risk, but that's kind of where we started the work. Next principle establishes quality of individual and community life and well-being, and not necessarily cessation of the drug use as a criteria for successful interventions and policies. We're not looking to help someone end their substance use if they do not want to. If their plan is to end their substance use, definitely we can provide them with support and the appropriate referrals for them to do so, but we understand that's not everyone's goal. That our goal should be to establish a quality of life for them, for themselves, and for their well-being in their community, in their housing, for them to be successful. And that's the criteria for us to build our interventions around. This calls for the non-judgmental, non-coercive provision of services and resources to people who use drugs and the communities in which they live in order to assist them in reducing attendant harm. So this really does mean that we've got to participate and come at this very genuinely, that we have to show no judgment one way or the other for their level of use. That is the only way we're going to get someone to be honest with us on their current level of use. And it has to be non-coercive, meaning we cannot force someone into services or resources if they do not want those services. It has to, that motivation of change, that control to change has to come from them. And we are then there to facilitate that process and talk to them about healthy alternatives. That doesn't mean you shut down the conversation if someone says, no, I don't want to change my use right now. We continue to talk to them about the current risks, the behaviors that they're using, rather than the use itself. You start talking about the behaviors that they're partaking in because they're under the influence or because of the behavior that they're doing, and how do we reduce the harm of those behaviors. So it becomes about that. It still is about them. It becomes about their use. It becomes about finding healthy alternatives to their use and a safer method for them to express themselves, relax, whatever they are accomplishing out of that risky behavior in a way that's safer for them in the community. Next principle ensures that drug users and those with a history of drug use routinely have a real voice in the creation of programs and policies designed to serve them. Now, this talks about engaging with individuals on a community level and asking for their feedback. We ask for feedback from participants here at BRC on the shelter floor. We ask for program participation surveys where we ask how is it that we can improve resources and our services and our strategies in meeting individuals' needs. We also have a house meeting, I think it's weekly, at the BRC shelter where individuals can receive updates on program shelters, but also have an update on rules and talk a little bit about their current state and how things are going so that we have a real voice in this. This is a small way. Of course, we can always do better, but this is a small way for us to have that real voice in changing our policies or making sure that the policies really are addressing the needs of the community. Next principle affirms drug users themselves as the primary agents of reducing the harms of their drug use and seeks to empower users to share information and support each other in strategies which meet their actual conditions of use. So this really talks about that locus of control. That change agent has to be the actual individual. We cannot convince anyone to change. It has to come internally. So what we want to do is empower them, share information and support in different strategies that'll meet their actual needs. So really taking a look at what are the conditions of their actual use, how are they using, when are they using, what substances are they using, how are they combining those substances, what are the conditions of their actual use, is it night, is it day, are they using safer needles, are they sharing needles, so that we can really work with them to minimize harm and risk to themselves and others. Next principle recognizes that the realities of poverty, class, racism, social isolation, past trauma, sex-based discrimination, and other social inequalities affect people's vulnerability to and capacity for effectively dealing with drug-related or risky behavior and harm. So yes, we are part of a multifaceted society, and individuals may be oppressed with any one of these levels of trauma, with poverty, with classism, with racism, with the trauma that we experienced in our past, sex-based discrimination. We are either micro-traumatized or traumatized to a point where we're triggered. And one of the ways individuals sometimes cope is through substance use or through self-medication. And we talked about licit and illicit drug use. Illicit would be illegal, licit would be legal. So that might be painkillers, that might be prescription medication, not used in the manner where that a medical provider intended for you to use. So that could be taking NyQuil to be intoxicated, large quantities that could affect your liver and things like that. So these realities exist in our world, and it makes people vulnerable to the effects of drug use and also makes it harder for them to deal with substance use. Also sometimes makes it harder for them to break out of some of these cycles. So I recognize that these realities exist, and the strategies that we talk about sometimes can only go so far without addressing larger community level and systemic change, which is also something we should push for. The next principle, it does not attempt to minimize or ignore the real and tragic harm and danger associated with licit and illicit drug use. So just because we're practicing harm reduction does not mean that we ignore or minimize the tragic harm and danger associated with risky behaviors and substance use. It doesn't mean we condemn it on one end in our individuals, but that doesn't mean we don't acknowledge that it doesn't exist. We don't tell our participants, oh, that's okay, you're using your own needle, you're no longer sharing needles, great, you're done, you're living a well-balanced life. They're still using needles to inject themselves with a substance that's affecting their mind and their body, their ability to cope with other infections, their ability to cope with their environment. Right, so it doesn't ignore that harm, but it works with the individual to really reduce the harm. Okay, second page. Here are some examples of harm reduction: needle exchange programs, condom distribution, safe sex education in high schools and middle schools. HomeFirst is also a harm reduction practice. Overdose prevention and clinics where someone is allowed to rest and recuperate if they are coming down from a substance safely with medical treatment team there. Seatbelts in cars are also a harm reduction example. Methadone clinics are also a harm reduction program. And there's a last open one. I left open for you guys to think about what other examples of harm reduction exist in our community. So facilitator, if you need to, please put me on pause and let's have a discussion about what are some other examples of harm reduction in our community in the United States and the state of California. Okay, so hopefully you've paused me and had that discussion. And if there, I'll throw one in there, an example. In some communities, they are having in 18 and under clubs, 16 to 18 clubs, where individuals of that age group can go and learn to party and learn to dance and have fun without substances being there. So there's 16 to 18 clubs that are designed for individuals to dance and socialize without alcohol, without substances being present, so that they can have an idea of how they can go out to a club without really engaging, without having to engage or feeling the pressures to engage in alcohol or other substances. So that's an example right there. So here's are some advantages of harm reduction approaches. Harm reduction empowers people to make their own choices. Right? At the end of the day, this is about what works for them, and that's what we're here to promote. It accepts people as they are without judgment. We are looking at this person wholly and completely and focusing on the mission of our agency, which is to cultivate people's potential to get housed and stay housed and build their stability, right? That potential. It helps engage clients in services or participants in services, provides them with resources as needed. And it works on the premises that's easier to get someone to make smaller changes than it is for them to make bigger changes. So someone can add to their safer changes and reduce their risky changes one step at a time. Change is much more likely to happen in that level, on that small level, than it is if we ask them to cut down from 2 packs of cigarettes a day to half a pack, right? That's a really big change. But if we ask someone to cut down from a pack a day to, I don't know, I think there's 10 cigarettes in a pack, to 8 cigarettes. So that's reducing 2 cigarettes per day and taking a look at what does that look like financially for them? Well, how much money do they save, or how many cigarettes will they have left at the end of the month, and how they can make it last. Financial budgeting is a large part of how we can make harm reduction practices and interventions really stick. If we can work with an individual to think about the benefits of them saving their money in order to put towards housing, in order to put towards groceries or paying their bills, that's a larger level that allows for them to then sustain the change after we've had the discussion and showed them how they can make these changes. Of course, it's a housing first approach to drug use, that we've got to work with someone right away, house them, and then work on some of the safety conditions. And harm reduction does the same thing. We want to make sure to engage with individuals, enroll them in our programs, and then work on safer use. The focus is on the impact of use, right? The ability for one person to keep their job, on the effect that they have on their children, or getting their children back, or getting a promotion. The use of drugs alone is not a basis for dismissal. That's something that we practice all throughout HomeFirst, is we do not dismiss someone for programs because they use drugs, because they use substances. We are a low barrier shelter model for our shelter services, and none of our programs are designed to have substance use as part of the program guidelines or parameters for eligibility. Program participants have had substance use issues and have been able to successfully maintain employment and housing. Right? That's what we found out. That's kind of what works. We've been able to work with individuals who use substances but can still have a job and maintain their housing, and they're able to do so successfully. There was a joke that a participant made not too long ago, that if there are people out there that are working and living alcoholics, functioning alcoholics, why can't I be one of those functioning alcoholics? right? So our participants also deserve the chance to maintain their own balance and find what that wellness looks like for them in reducing the use of their intended harm in their communities and for themselves. Okay, so back to the spectrum. So that was our worksheet, and we took a look at some of those strategies. That's for you to sort of have and hold. So we've reviewed the harm reduction worksheet at this point. If there's any questions about it or any questions on the language of the principles, facilitator, please feel free to put me on hold here so we can address everyone's current needs and questions. Okay, we'll get started. So here's the spectrum of use. We've been talking about this, what that looks like. So on one end, we've got abstinence. Whoops, sorry about that, too fast. On one end, we have abstinence. On the other end, we have the dangerous behaviors to our health, right? So in between, there are very many levels of increments where we can work with an individual to build safety and to develop a sense of well-being for them and their community. So if someone is here and exchanging needles and mixing alcohol with other medication and doing that at 10 a.m. every day and passing out, not knowing where they are, then we can really work with them to address the risks of these behaviors and lower the risks of these behaviors one step at a time. And what does that look like for them? And I hope these are some of the discussions that you will get into when we play a little game here on harm reduction. So one of the things to keep in mind is when having this conversation with participants that you want to communicate what you're doing and what you're saying about their substance use with respect. That addressing risky and harmful behaviors should be done in a way that supports growth and keeps their interest at the center of the conversation. This is not about what we think is best for them. This is about what they understand about their use and what they feel is the best step for them to gain safety in their lives and in their current levels of use or risky behavior. These conversations should include the consequences of that risky behavior and ask them to think about safer alternatives. So even the alternatives we should think about is coming from the individual. Of course, if they're having a hard time, we can try to kind of use opposites or strategies to have them think about, if they're doing this, what would be another strategy? So you can definitely probe and ask for their healthier alternatives. And if they're struggling with it, maybe you make a suggestion and see how that goes, see how that would apply. But for the most part, this should come from them, the healthy alternatives. And communicating with respect goes a long way. If we cannot have a genuine conversation, if the person does not trust you, does not feel safe about the agenda or what you're trying to say to them in this conversation, they're more than likely not going to share with you the entirety of their use. They might just share what is socially acceptable or the level that they may have shared with other providers, at which point they were not kicked out of the program and what was acceptable for them there. So you really want to take the time to explain harm reduction and say that we really work with individuals through all spectrum of uses, and just because you use doesn't mean we are going to kick you out of our program or our shelter, but we really want to talk to you about how do we support your understanding of risky behavior and how we can work together to help reduce some of those risks. All right, so it's time for you to put me on pause, facilitator. We're going to play the risk lineup game here with harm reduction. And there's some risk lineup cards for you to put up. Some materials you'll need are, of course, those cards and some tape. And the instructions are with the facilitators, so please have at it. All right, so I hope you've played the risk lineup game and had a rousing time. I wish this could be an icebreaker at more trainings. It's a great way for us to understand the positionality of someone who is taking risks. And again, these cards hold some of the risky behaviors our participants engage in, but not all. These are some of them are centered around substance use, but I'm sure you can think of many more behavior that someone can engage in that we can also work to identify those intended harms, the risks, and how is it that we can work with the individual to increase safety in their lives. So some of the debrief some of the takeaways I want you to think about are that there's many factors that influence the degree of risk in behavior or in use. Lots of things are genetics and other areas that influence why one thing would be more detrimental to us than someone else. And our current personhood, what kind of job you have, what kind of skill set you have, if you have children at home or not, your age, if you have a good communication system with your doctor, if you have a doctor, if you check in with your doctor, if they know that you're also using substances on top of taking the medication that they're prescribing you. All those factors come into play. It's important to talk to participants about their use and the risks attached to their behavior. This was the key takeaway for me in playing this game, is to understand how is it that we can have these conversations and to really highlight the risks, to really highlight the risks of each type of behavior and address it in the moment. And how do we then assist the participant that we're serving in reducing the risk to themselves and the harm to others? So how do we do that? So once we've talked about those risks, what are we willing to do about them? How are we willing to change them? How are they willing to change them? And that's the conversation really that starts off the kick of harm reduction in their mind for themselves to address. I want you to think about how is it that we can have these conversations so that someone can start thinking about reducing that harm. One of the other strategies that the examples that we didn't talk about in the lineup game was, let's say, unprotected sex. So if someone's having unprotected sex while they're staying on the streets, maybe as an economic way of sort of increasing their funds, maybe not, just to convey love that they really, and if they have multiple partners especially, that could be highly risky for sexually transmitted infections. So talking to them about the risks of sexually transmitted infections and what they can do, how they can either participate or obtain condoms, maybe having some available and easy access for you to share with them, having access to clinics and understanding where they can test on their STIs and their current health would be a great way to start that conversation, and for them to think about, why is it that they're participating in this behavior? And is there an alternative to this behavior if it is financially driven or driven in some other capacity, for them to meet their needs in an alternative way? So that's another quick example of how we can turn a conversation about risky behaviors into a way of modifying and engaging in a healthy discussion with them. Again, I'm not minimizing the risk of their behavior, but I'm helping them point out to them what those risks are, and for them to understand what steps they can take to reduce some of those risks. Again, the point for us is to continue the conversation. We want to check in with the participant about their use, their behavior during your one-on-one check-in. Ask them about any new factors that might be coming to light, any changes. Were they prescribed a new medication? Are they using less? What are the thoughts about other people that they're socializing with? Has that affected them in any other way? Ask about how the safer use alternatives are working. Ask about what are the benefits they're seeing, because they're more likely to then stabilize and continue to use safely if they can recognize how this is working for them, if it's working for them successfully. And if it's not, how can we work with them to modify some of these risks? And then how can we continue to address and explore safer choices? Now that we've made this smaller leap, how can we make it to the next smaller leap if that's what they'd like to do? In order to address these changes, we've got to continue this conversation on a regular basis. It can't be that, harm reduction is a part of something that you did at intake, as part of your biopsychosocial, as part of your VISPDA or documentation, and we left it at that. This has to be a real, genuine conversation that we have to engage with someone in services, to engage with them in reducing harm to themselves and to others. All right, so that's our training so far. If there's any questions, please feel free to pause me, but we've come to an end, so you definitely can continue to have these conversations afterwards. I want to thank you for participating. I want to thank the facilitator for being on top of playing this game. This was not easy, and I hope that the takeaways were just as important for you as they were for me. And again, thank you for being a part of the HomeFirst team, and I look forward to training with you another time.